The sound of the termination letter echoed louder than the rain hammering against the glass walls of the executive office. It wasn't just paper sliding across a desk. It was the sound of a man's dignity being quietly dismantled. The ruthless CEO didn't look up as she signed the final stroke of her pen, her expression cold, calculated, untouched by the storm outside or the one she had just created in someone else's life. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that within hours, the name she had just erased from her company would rise again, written in ink on her late father's will. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the unseen value of people, take a moment right now to like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this aren't just stories, they remind us who we are meant to be. Her name was Elena Voss, a woman who had built her reputation on efficiency, discipline, and an almost surgical ability to remove anything or anyone that didn't serve the company's growth. Employees feared her more than they respected her, and perhaps she preferred it that way. Respect could be fragile. Fear was reliable. Since taking over her father's corporation after his death, she had hardened herself into something unrecognizable even to those who once knew her. Compassion had become a liability. Emotions, a weakness, and people were replaceable. That morning had been no different. The quarterly reports had shown a minor dip in operational efficiency, something most leaders would have considered negligible, but not Elena. She demanded perfection. And when her sharp eyes traced the inefficiencies back to maintenance logs, missed shifts, delayed cleaning schedules, small inconsistencies, she made a decision without hesitation. The janitorial staff would be reduced, and one name in particular caught her attention: Daniel Reyes. Daniel was a single father who had been working as a janitor in the building for nearly 6 years. His record wasn't perfect, but it wasn't terrible either. What it reflected, though, was something Elena refused to see: late arrivals caused by dropping his young daughter at school, early departures to pick her up when she was sick, missed shifts when life simply became too overwhelming for a man carrying the weight of 2 lives on one fragile set of shoulders. To Elena, it was inefficiency. To Daniel, it was survival. When he stood in her office, soaked from the rain, clutching his worn-out cap in his hands, he didn't beg. That was what struck her most. He didn't argue or defend himself with desperation. He simply nodded, his eyes carrying a quiet exhaustion that had long ago replaced anger. He accepted the termination letter like a man who had already been bracing for impact. And then he thanked her for the opportunity, thanked her for the years of work. That moment lingered in the room longer than he did, even after he walked out into the storm with nothing but a cardboard box and a heart too tired to break again. Elena dismissed it quickly. Sentimentality was inefficient. The hours that followed were consumed by meetings, numbers, projections, and the endless machinery of corporate life. But by evening, everything changed. She found herself seated in a dimly lit conference room with a group of attorneys, the air heavy with formality and unspoken tension. It was time to finalize the reading of her father's will, a process she had delayed for months. Her relationship with her father had been complicated. He was a man who believed in people, often to a fault. She had spent years trying to prove that his softness was the company's greatest weakness. But now, as the lawyer began to read, she felt something unfamiliar creeping in: unease. The will started as expected: assets, shares, properties, charitable donations. Her name appeared frequently, as the primary heir. She remained composed, her expression unchanged. But then, the lawyer paused, adjusted his glasses, and read a line that made the room feel suddenly smaller. A portion of the company's shares, along with a significant financial trust, was to be given to Daniel Reyes. The name hit her like a physical force. For a moment she thought she had misheard, but the lawyer repeated it, slowly, clearly. Daniel Reyes, the same man she had fired just hours ago, the same janitor she had deemed expendable. Her heartbeat grew louder, drowning out the rest of the room. Confusion quickly turned into disbelief, and disbelief into something far more unsettling. Why would her father, who had been meticulous with every decision, leave anything to a janitor? It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. But as the lawyer continued, the truth began to unravel. Years ago, long before Elena had taken over the company, her father had fallen seriously ill during a late evening at the office. Most employees had already left. The building was quiet, empty, except for one man, the janitor who had just started working there, Daniel Reyes. He had found her father collapsed on the floor and had acted without hesitation. He called emergency services, stayed with him, and quite possibly saved his life. But it didn't end there. In the months that followed, as her father recovered, Daniel continued to help in ways that went far beyond his job description. He ran errands, ensured the old man never skipped his medication, and most importantly, treated him not as a powerful CEO, but as a human being, a lonely one. Elena had been too busy building her own career to notice how isolated her father had become. But Daniel had noticed, and he had cared. Her father had tried to reward him financially, but Daniel had refused anything beyond his salary. He didn't see it as a transaction. To him, it was simply the right thing to do. That was when her father made a decision. If Daniel would not accept kindness as a gift, then he would receive it as a legacy. By the time the reading ended, Elena felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. The image she had constructed of her father, of herself, was beginning to crack. For the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't control: guilt. That night, she couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her had only just begun. She replayed the moment in her office over and over again. The way Daniel had stood there, the quiet dignity, the absence of resentment. And now, knowing what she knew, his calmness felt even heavier. He hadn't mentioned her father, hadn't used it as leverage, hadn't tried to protect himself with the truth. He had simply accepted his fate. Because that was who he was. The next morning, Elena did something no one in her company had ever seen before. She canceled all her meetings, ignored her schedule, and left the building without explanation. Her destination wasn't a boardroom or a business lunch. It was a small, modest neighborhood on the edge of the city. An area she had never visited, never needed to. It took time to find the address. When she finally stood in front of the small, aging house, she hesitated. The paint was chipped, the yard was uneven, but there were signs of care everywhere. Flowers growing in mismatched pots, a child's bicycle leaning against the wall, a sense of life that felt strangely warm. When the door opened, Daniel looked just as surprised to see her as she was unsure of what to say. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusation, just curiosity, and behind him, peeking from the hallway, was a little girl with bright eyes and a cautious smile. In that moment, Elena realized something that no balance sheet or profit margin could ever teach her. She had spent years measuring value in numbers, in output, in efficiency. But she had never understood the true worth of a person, not until now. What followed wasn't immediate forgiveness or a dramatic reconciliation. Change doesn't happen that easily. But it started with something simple, an apology, a genuine one, not from a CEO to an employee, but from one human being to another. And slowly, things began to shift. Daniel didn't return to the company as a janitor. Instead, he was offered a role that reflected not just his loyalty, but his character, working in community outreach programs that Elena's father had quietly supported. Programs Elena had once considered unnecessary expenses. Together, they began to rebuild not just the company's image, but its soul. Elena changed too, not overnight, but gradually. She began to listen more, to see people not as functions, but as individuals with stories she had never bothered to hear. The company didn't collapse because of it. In fact, it grew stronger. Because for the first time, it was built on something more than profit. It was built on purpose. And Daniel? He didn't become rich in the way most people imagine. But he gained something far more valuable: stability, respect, and a future for his daughter that no longer depended on surviving one day at a time. Before we reach the end, if this story has touched your heart even a little, take a moment to engage with the video. Like it, share it, and tell us your thoughts, because your support keeps stories like this alive. And here's a special request. Comment, "Kindness always finds its way back," if you believe that even the smallest good deed can change a life. In the end, Elena often found herself standing by the large glass windows of her office, watching the city below. But now, when she looked down, she didn't just see numbers and opportunities. She saw people, lives, stories waiting to be understood. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones who hold the power to change everything.